Hi, I'm Ian Bremer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. As you may know, I'm host of the weekly GZERO World show on Facebook Watch. And in this podcast, we share extended versions of the big interviews from that show. This week, I sit down with New York Times foreign correspondent Rukmini Callimachi. Rukmini is one of the foremost experts on ISIS. She's in daily contact with ISIS fighters and has reported extensively from Iraq and Syria. Recently, she was one of the first Western journalists to report from freshly liberated Mosul and Tel Afar, Iraq. She is a fearless reporter with unique insight into one of the most important and misunderstood terrorist organizations in the world. Let's get to it.
GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of service, trust, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
I'm here today at the New York Times boardroom with Rukmini Callimachi. She's the foreign correspondent at the New York Times and go-to journalist on all things ISIS. Rukmini, very good to be with you. Hey, let me start with right now, which is this horrifying act of depravity in Vegas.
Sure.
Which ISIS appears, at least from my perspective, to have absolutely nothing to do with.
Right.
But they claimed that it was them.
They did,
First of all, I mean, did that come from a real ISIS source, or was this sort of fake news?
It absolutely came from a real ISIS source. So ISIS now has a chain of custody when they put out their claims of responsibility. And typically the first media outlet within ISIS that puts it out is something called the Amaq news agency. I call it the Associated Press of ISIS. It's basically their wire service. And they put out all of these claims. So it was indeed Amaq in their encrypted channels on the app Telegram that put it out. It was then picked up by something called...
How soon between
So the attack was around 10 p.m. Sunday night, I believe.
Right.
And it was morning Monday.
Okay.
So less than a day, which is typical. They tend to take 12 to 24 hours to claim things. It was then picked up by Nashir, which is another official ISIS outlet, and from there it was propagated on YouTube, on their channels, in their chat rooms, etc. We're all puzzled, by this claim, and the reason we're puzzled is contrary to I think what people think of ISIS. This is not a group that typically makes inaccurate claims regarding their responsibility in attacks. They do typically exaggerate the death toll. They'll make it out that they had a larger role than they sometimes have. But in terms of claiming credit for things that they or their sympathizers have done, they have generally been correct. And I can give you a number of examples where both officials, the FBI, European intelligence poo-pooed the claim, only
and
for us.
And
probably the most obvious one is soon after the Paris attacks in November of 2015. You might recall that ISIS claimed that they had downed the Metrojet flight that was flying from a resort in Egypt back to Russia, killing several hundred people.
Yep.
Everybody I talked to said that was not possible. And very soon after, ISIS claimed it. And
from Sharm el-Sheikh or something like that?
Yes, exactly. It had left from Sharm el-Sheikh, and I think the debris was found over the Sinai Desert.
Right.
And ISIS claimed it first by one of their regional affiliates. Everybody thought that they were lying, and then not long after, in their magazine, they published images of the type of bomb that they had used. They said that it had been hidden inside of a soft drink inside the plane. And I think it was weeks or months later, the investigation found explosive residue and concluded that it was indeed ISIS.
So look, this only happened a day ago, I understand, but you have a pet theory at this point as to why they've decided that they want to be responsible for a Vegas attack they had nothing to do with?
I don't. And we don't, of course, we don't yet know. We don't yet know what this guy's motivations were. So what we do know is he was a 64-year-old retiree. That is not the demographic of most ISIS recruits. If you think of an ISIS recruit, it's really somebody like Omar Mateen, the Orlando shooter, young, disaffected, had a problematic personal life, and was deeply into their ideology online. Now, Why would they do this? I don't know. But what is of interest is they're really bearing down on it. They're not just making the claim once; they're making it repeatedly. They're having discussions with their own members because their own members are now facing are asking questions.
So that sounds to me like you think maybe there's actually really something there.
Everything says it's not ISIS. The age of the perpetrator, all of that, the information that the FBI is giving us. But at the same time, I don't understand why ISIS would go so strongly.
Well, the other thing I guess I would ask is, has ISIS as an organization, since effectively losing their caliphate, have they changed? Have you noticed in their leadership, in the way they've acted, in their ideology? Are they different today in a meaningful way from the way they were, let's say, at the height of their territorial expansion?
Sure. I mean, I think there's certainly qualitative differences. I would not say that they've lost their caliphate. So I just want to clarify that one point. I was just in Mosul. I was there for 2 months this summer. I was there on the day that
when it was taken,
when the city was declared liberated. Right. Even after Mosul fell, there was still the city of Tal Afar that has since fallen. Now, just in Iraq, there is still the city of Hawija, the city of Al-Qaim, the Anbar Desert, which is where they came from. Right? When I left Mosul a couple of weeks ago, I sent an email to CENTCOM to ask for their assessment of how many fighters were left following the fall of Mosul. And keep in mind, that's just the Iraqi Caliphate. We also have Syria, right? And they estimated that after the fall of Mosul, there were 10 to 15,000 ISIS fighters left. If you go back through congressional testimony, you'll find out that at the moment when American troops pulled out of Iraq several years ago, they estimated the strength of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is the group that becomes ISIS, to be around 700 fighters. So we're, even now, after the fall of Mosul, we're 15 times the strength that they emerge from, right? And another comparison, Ali Soufan, FBI special agent, is fond of pointing out that on the eve of 9/11, there were an estimated 200 to 300 Al-Qaeda members worldwide. So what we're seeing with this group is, even, obviously, taking the territory, incredibly important. But even as you take the territory, even as they face devastating losses of leadership, of property, of their riches, of their base, they are still there. And I think that we have not yet figured out exactly how to really handicap this group.
So to go back to the question of how have they changed?
Yes.
And then I want to ask you what motivates them. But what do you see? Because again, it has to be clear. From anyone that looks at ISIS inside the organization, that they're not where they were.
Right.
Even if they're a lot stronger than we still presume they are.
Right.
What has that done to them?
So obviously, their infrastructure is increasingly in disarray. Their media operation is less slick than it used to be. So one possible theory for what's happened in Vegas is that they've become sloppy. They've made 2 other errors, at least, in the past 6 months. They claimed an attack in Paris that never happened. They claimed one in the Philippines that also was not ISIS-related. So possibly, as they're losing territory and personnel, perhaps their capacity to project their power and to provide the services that they've always provided as a media outlet, as an organization that holds territory, is also being eroded. But the thing about ISIS is in the end, this is an idea. I don't think we have found a way yet to shoot our way out of an idea. And because it's an idea, it's malleable. So even though they claim that the caliphate, the territorial caliphate, was really their end all, they have, in the wake of losing Mosul, they have very craftily basically moved the goalpost. They're now talking about the caliphate in our hearts. The caliphate remains, the territory, it's no longer a territory that's just on the ground, it's etched in our hearts. And Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who was their charismatic spokesman who was killed last year, in one of his final speeches, he talked about how, he talked about when will we declare defeat? He said, will we declare defeat when you grab the territory from us? Will you declare defeat when every last one of our leaders will be dead? He said, you will only declare defeat over us when you have ripped the Quran out of the hearts of Muslims. So again, they believe that they're fighting for Muslims. And so they're very protean. And even as they lose ground, they manage to regenerate themselves.
Now, when Al-Qaeda was at its height, we talked about them as more of a nihilist organization ultimately that wanted to sort of destroy everything that didn't necessarily really stand for the same committed ideology. With ISIS, that's not been what we've discussed.
I somewhat disagree with that.
How so? Tell me.
There's a sort of trope in the way that experts talk about ISIS and Al-Qaeda, where Al-Qaeda is this and ISIS is somehow different. So, for example, one of the things that gets repeated erroneously, in my opinion, about Al-Qaeda is that Al-Qaeda did not want to hold ground, that Al-Qaeda did not want a state. That's not true. The only difference is Al-Qaeda, strategically speaking, and probably from a place of wisdom, understood that if they declared a caliphate, that they declared basically a country, that would bring enemy fire. So, for example, when I used to be based in Mali, I was in West Africa for almost 8 years, and I covered Al-Qaeda's takeover of northern Mali, which was an area that was the size of Afghanistan.
That's when you picked up all those documents.
That's when I picked up. That was the beginning, really, of this journey for me. When they took the northern half of Mali, they did almost exactly the same thing that we're seeing in Raqqa and Mosul in the wake of their caliphate. They declared a court. They set up institutions. They began providing public services, taxation. The only difference is, and I saw this in the letters that I recovered, they were very specific in not announcing their presence, to the point where they were using a local Tuareg group and claiming that the Tuareg group was holding the territory. So when I was covering it from outside, until I reached there, I too was confused. I didn't understand, is Al-Qaeda really holding Timbuktu? Or is Ansar Dine, which this other group that we know very little about, are they holding Timbuktu? And the letters then said that they were actively telling them, use Ansar Dine as a fig leaf. Hide behind a local group, because otherwise, the enemy can.
Now, do you think that ISIS wanted and wants the United States to be leading a military attack against them? Do you think that's useful for them?
They certainly have said that, right? If you look at their pronouncements, they're always trying to bait not just the United States, but what they call the Crusaders, which is all of us, right, into a battle, an end of times battle with the Islamic State. When U.S. hostage Kasig was killed, he was killed in a little town in Syria called Dabiq. Dabiq is a nothing town. If you look it up, I can't remember the population, but really a speck of a town on the map of Syria. But it was a place that had an outsized significance for ISIS, because Dabiq is mentioned in Islamic scripture as one of the places where the end of times battle begins. And when they killed him, they made a speech to the effect where they said, I'm paraphrasing here, the Crusaders' boots have now arrived in Dabiq. We have now shed the first of their blood here. Let this battle begin. Now, at the same time, a lot of the rhetoric has to do with ending airstrikes. Right, so you'd think that if they're baiting us, then they should be quite happy about the airstrikes. They're not happy about the airstrikes. They want us to be there with boots on the ground, so that they're fighting us, man to man, and I guess woman to man. But the airstrikes they see as an unfair show of force.
So let me change a little bit to what you know of these guys.
Sure.
Right. I understand when you say that. We can't shoot our way into destroying an idea, destroying an ideology, destroying the hearts of men. What is motivating? The fact that there are so many more of them than there were of Al-Qaeda.
Right.
What you've met with many, some active in ISIS, and many more that have been surrendered or have been arrested. Are you finding sort of similar stories in how we are motivating and creating this extraordinarily disaffected group?
Right. I think the common thread that I'm seeing in the young men, and they're almost always young men that I'm speaking to, the common thread is contrary to popular perception. They really do mean what they're doing. Right, they're not joining ISIS because they were dumped by their girlfriend, and it's a way to get back at the world, or because there was some sort of school dropout and had no place in the society. They're joining it because it means something to be part of what they think is going to be this Muslim Renaissance. They once they enter sort of this, this echo chamber of ISIS acolytes, they very quickly learn to shut themselves off from any external media. They call people like me and you, I guess, the kuffar media, the infidel media, the crusader media. So everything we put out is wrong. Everything we are agents of our governments. So anything that we put out is obviously untrue. And then inside this echo chamber, they are led to believe that ISIS is bringing back a Muslim golden age, a place where Muslims are going to be honored and powerful and lead an empire like they did hundreds of years ago. And because the killings are only aimed at the other, right? So the killings are of non-Sunni Muslims in their eyes. Of course, Sunni Muslims are also being killed, but this is what they're led to believe. It somehow makes it okay. It's Christians that are being killed. It's Jews that are being killed. They're spies. They're out to get Muslims. And the ones that I'm speaking to, of course, are somewhat self-selected because their ability or willingness to speak to somebody like me means that at some level they've pulled out of the ideology, right? And so I'm seeing them at the point where they have been somewhat disenchanted. With the group.
What's disenchanted? Just the horrible conditions? Or?
So the stories that I gather from them over and over again involve a disillusionment that comes at the moment when they realize that Sunni Muslims are also
getting targeted.
Are also being mistreated. So, for example, one member of ISIS who I spoke to, who was involved in executions, talked about how he saw the crucifixions, he saw the beheadings, and he somehow justified them as being the bad guys. And then one day he was pulled on execution duty, and the men that they brought in front of him were older men, and they were protesting and saying to him, we're Sunnis, don't kill us, we're Sunnis, we're just like you. And the gun was in his hand, and he had to go ahead and do it. And that really worked him over. Suddenly he's like, oh, wait a second, if I'm also killing Sunni Muslims, then what are we doing? We're killing everybody.
But even the enslavement of women, the multiple rapes, again, that level of atrocity doesn't matter as long as against the enemy, it's okay, they've swallowed that all.
So it's always against somebody other than their group.
So it's only when they see hypocrisy on the part of their own leadership.
I mean, it's not only, but that seems to be the, the pulling out story that I find, at least the most convincing one. The ones that have really turned their backs on the group. I've also spoken to ISIS emirs, deputy emirs who are in prison now in Iraq and Syria, and who remain, really quite deep in the ideology and quite arrogant in their assessment that no, these things are not happening. There are no abuses under ISIS. I actually spoke to one ISIS emir just before coming back here. He was the police chief of a small town outside of Mosul, and he looked very down. When I was talking to him, and I said to him, "You look kind of distressed. What's wrong?" And he said, I really believe them when they said that because we believe in God, Muslims are going to be victorious. I never thought that I'd be sitting here in handcuffs. I mean, it's really like a shock to me. Okay. Do you think that ISIS should have done anything differently? He said, yes, I think we should have tried to find more job opportunities for people under our rule. Crucifixions, that was okay. Beheadings, that was okay. Enslavement of Yazidi women, all fine. We should have just had a few more job opportunities, right? Yeah. This is how deeply this guy is in this particular world. Right?
So when you saw the Bin Laden capture,
yes.
Again, sort of this incredible figure for many followers, and suddenly sort of killed, and then of course the stories about his pornography stash and
Sure.
How much of that, if you're like a typical ISIS member, is do you think that that's all just nonsense? Is it fake news?
The pornography stuff is totally fake news. They believe that it's been planted there to denigrate one of their heroes. His death is an interesting case study because, of course, the message that came out of Washington, at that point in time, is Al-Qaeda has been decapitated. The group is on the run. All of these other smaller groups all over the world are really not in any sort of meaningful connection with Al-Qaeda. It's more just this piecemeal organization. And of course, that wasn't true. Al-Qaeda now is considered to have a stronger force than ever. The Syrian affiliate of Al-Qaeda is bigger than the mothership ever was. You know, thousands of fighters, foreigners, recruits from all over the world. I've spent most of the last couple of years looking at ISIS, and my focus is not as much on Al-Qaeda anymore. But what experts who I trust say is they fear that Al-Qaeda is stronger than ever, you know, and that what they're doing is they're just gleefully watching as their enemy, ISIS, is being cannibalized, you know, by the entire world is fighting ISIS. And they, on the other hand, have been able to, you know, just shore up their support.
And in Yemen, for example.
In Yemen, in Syria, senior leaders have been released from custody, and that they're poised for a real resurgence.
So it sounds like, from your view, we're losing the war on terror.
Yeah, I mean, from my view, we're doing all sorts of things that seem to make sense. We're going after the leadership. We're pulling back their territory. We're trying to cut down on their presence online, and yet the group just keeps on burgeoning. Both of them. Right, and I don't actually have an answer. I don't know what needs to happen in order to fix this problem. All I know is that despite these various efforts, we're kind of just treading water. You know.
I don't want to end it with that. That's just too depressing. But it's a good end. So you're right now. You are talking with an active member of ISIS. What's that like? What's going through your head when you're actually, this isn't someone's been captured, someone's actually right now is trying to kill the infidel.
Right.
What do you think about that?
You know, in order to do this job, I've had to compartmentalize, you know, many aspects of my life. For example, if I stop to think about what he thinks of women, and that I am a woman, you know, there's very little that we can talk about. When I stop to think about what his idea is of how Yazidi girls, some as young as 8 or 9, have been treated, there's nothing to talk about because I would just feel angry, right? So I sort of have to just put these things aside and really just be a reporter and go to him for information. He's been useful to me in terms of reading statements that are being put out by ISIS. For example, right now he's telling me there's, last week he messaged me to say that ISIS has captured 2 Russian soldiers and that they're preparing to burn them, like the Jordanian pilot. This is stuff, you know, these are conversations that don't end up in my reporting because what would I, you know, what's the point of putting out something so horrific like that? Just today, ISIS put out an official statement showing a proof of life of these 2 soldiers, and he is telling me that they've actually been burned alive. So, you know, I mean, it's information I take in, and I try to use it to get my bearings, you know, in this group, and understand what's what and what's coming, and also on things like Vegas. You know, I go to him for guidance. You know, do you believe this? Is this real? And try to suss out what they're saying.
So, it's easy. There are so many different political angles that you have when you're outside of the region.
Yeah.
In saying you understand why people would be upset and disenchanted, or you understand why these people should all be killed because they've done such horrifying things.
Yeah.
You've spent your life getting much closer to them than anyone that's watching the show will have done.
For sure.
How has that changed your view of them?
The major change came to me in 2013, which was the year that I was able to get to Timbuktu right after Al-Qaeda had left the city. Before I was there and before I collected their documents and began actually studying them up close, my impression of them was that they were just a bunch of guys in a cave, you know? Just these kind of Neanderthal people, backward-minded, monolithic in their thinking. And the documents I had in front of me showed me, for example, that they were required to turn in monthly expense reports. I had the disciplinary letter that was sent to a very famous member of Al-Qaeda in Africa, where he was being reprimanded for not having turned in his monthly expense report. He was always late turning in his expenses. And so I suddenly saw that they're acting a little bit like a corporation, you know, that they have financial rules. I recovered the documents that showed the internal debate and the struggle they had over the destruction of Timbuktu's mausoleums. It was a UNESCO World Heritage Site, much like Palmyra, right? And I had assumed, when they put out these videos, they showed themselves with pickaxes and shovels, destroying these hundreds of year-old artifacts in Timbuktu. I had imagined that they all agreed, right? And in fact, they hadn't. In fact, there were disputes among them, with some people saying, theologically, you're right. The Quran says that having a tomb that's
depicts a face or a body
that depicts a face, or that is a certain number of centimeters above the ground, invites idolatry. So the idea is to get rid of it because we're only praying to God. Theologically, you are right, but you need to remember that our jihad is like a seedling. We are still trying to prepare the ground for it to take hold, and by doing this, you angered the population, and we need the population to be on our side. Right, so you see them thinking it through, right? And
so
having
it's like the revolutionary versus the pragmatic wing in any government.
In any government, exactly, in any government. That was sort of the moment, when I realized, okay, there's more to this than that. And ISIS is many revolutions beyond that. Their caliphate ran, I think, 14 ministries. The Ministry of Taxation, the Ministry of the Treasury, the Ministry of Agriculture, and these actually ran. I have interviewed people who were employed in these ministries, where they had stamps and acted like bureaucrats. So in many ways, it really did act like a state that nobody recognized. So I guess my big takeaway is I don't underestimate them anymore. I don't make fun of them anymore. I see them as far more complicated and textured, and I hate to say it, but sophisticated than we typically give them credit for.
Well, a state that nobody recognizes, there's not much more GZERO than that. Rukmini, thank you very much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming here.
GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of service, trust, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.